Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first seminar discussion on Sudan. We are joined by two incredible professionals who work in the humanitarian sector. Before we begin, I noticed that there are people that I haven't worked with in the past who've actually registered to participate in this seminar. I'd like to welcome you all and, of course, to welcome old friends as well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Samanthi Gunarodhana. I'm a lecturer in development studies in the Faculty of Arts at Monash. I would like to also acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Bunurong peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. And I'm here in the lands of the Bunurong today. I'm working from home this afternoon. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and any First Nations people who are joining us today. So, as I said, welcome to this, what I hope to be will be the first installment in a series about Sudan. And in this particular one, because of the urgency of the humanitarian situation that is facing Sudan at the moment, we are focusing on this crisis. The situation in Sudan, I think, does demand our very urgent attention as millions of people are displaced. Famine has been declared in parts of the country, and half the population also requires humanitarian assistance. We know that healthcare facilities have been under attack. There have been reports of systematic gender-based violence, and more than 19 million children are lacking the opportunity to participate in education. We're really privileged today to be able to hear from the Norwegian Refugee Council, Noah Taylor, who is the head of operations for the NRC Sudan program, as well as Salma Abdullahi, who has over a decade of experience working on issues of gender-based violence programming in conflict-affected contexts, and she's currently working on protection issues and safeguarding. So they both bring a wealth of experience. You can read more extensively about their bios in the event description that you would have seen advertised online. So what we'll do is I'll now hand over to Noah and Salma, and they'll be giving some presentations and speaking to you about what is happening right now. And then when they've finished, I'll open up the discussion box. You can, I don't know if I've enabled people to speak, but you can definitely write down your questions in the chat or the Q&A. And please put down your questions or comments and observations as we proceed. I also want to just emphasize that today we're going to emphasize the humanitarian aspects of the current situation. So I will now stop speaking and I'll hand over to Noah, who's going to set the context for you. Thank you so much, Noah.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. I've realized that my name on Zoom says Salma as well. There's not two of us. My name's Noah. I'm Australian as well. I grew up in Castlemaine outside of Melbourne. So lovely to be able to speak with some Australians. Good afternoon to everybody. And thanks very much for taking the time. We'll get into this a little bit later, but it's great to see some interest in this coming out of Australia. There's not enough interest in Sudan globally, and definitely not enough interest in Sudan from some smaller countries that I feel could do a lot to start to influence the trajectory of this conflict and address some of the humanitarian needs. So it's a pleasure to have you all here. I'm going to start sharing my screen momentarily as soon as I can. Can you just let me know once you can see this? This was up.
We can see it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to kick us off with a general overview of Sudan, of the context, the humanitarian situation, and then a little bit on what NRC is currently doing to respond. So by the numbers, Let's start with that right now. Sudan is 11.5 million people displaced, and that's internally. That's people displaced internally within Sudan. On top of that, we have another 3.5 million refugees in Chad, Egypt, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Libya, and Uganda, and wider across the region, Kenya as well. That number can increase and largely sits around closer even to 5 million when you start looking at returnees, which are another category of legal people. But right now we're somewhere around 3.5 to 5. On top of that, we have 25 million people, and that's half the population of the entire country, that are in acute need of food, and that includes 1.5 million that are on the edge of famine. Now, 25 million people in acute need of food is not food shortages. That's 25 million people who are very desperately in need of food. And to be clear, 1.5 million on the edge of famine. Famine is the extreme end of food insecurity, and there are still deaths from starvation before you reach a famine threshold. So those that are unfamiliar with IPC thresholds, which is a metric used to categorize famine, acute food insecurity is extremely high, extremely worrying. How we got here? Essentially, I'll talk briefly about the conflict, and then I'll talk about the displacement and the sort of the humanitarian context. So the conflict largely is an ongoing active conflict between the SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces, and the RSF. The RSF is the Rapid Support Forces, and they are a paramilitary group that was former allies of the Sudan Armed Forces, and fighting broke out on April 15th, 2023 in Khartoum, and then very quickly spiraled across the country. Within these two primary warring factions, we have multiple armed groups across the country as well. These armed groups hold zones of control and influence. They hold changing relationships with both the RSF and the SAF. And why this is important is because it creates a real fragmentation of zones of control in the country, of who controls what at any time. This is also very difficult from a humanitarian perspective, as we need to navigate access into multiple areas through multiple layers of authorities, and that can really complicate actually reaching people in need. A future prospect of this is that continued sort of fragmentation. Those of you who may be more familiar with Sudan, the Sudan's political landscape is very fragmented itself before the war. The Juba Peace Agreement is a very good example of that, with a number of signatories that came together to try to chart a civilian path forward. So this is well in line with the way Sudanese politics has worked over the last 20 odd years. So this is the crux of the conflict that we have. Largely today, and we'll get to this on the next slide. Largely today, we're sitting in more or less two zones of control: one area under the Sudan Armed Forces and their allies, and one area under the Rapid Support Forces and their allies. And there has been some significant territorial changes this year, which I'll get to next. The humanitarian situation in Sudan is largely characterized, from my perspective, as a displacement and protection crisis. It is cyclical in nature, this displacement crisis. Right now, I'm in North Darfur. I'm in a town that's about 40 kilometers outside of Al Fasher, which is the capital of North Darfur. What we're seeing right now here, following recent attacks on Zamzam camp and Al Fasher city, is people that are coming to Tawila, who have been displaced 3, 4, 5 times this year alone. People are making choices on a day-by-day, week-by-week, month-by-month basis of where to move their families and how to maintain some level of stability and safety. This is different to the type of humanitarian crisis that we've seen before, where you have a large shock that rapidly displaces a lot of people or bifurcates a country, or a refugee crisis that creates a single movement. Sudan is fluid, circular and cyclical movement, people being displaced on multiple occasions through multiple shocks, multiple instances of violence, and without any stability to set their family. From a humanitarian perspective, this makes responding incredibly difficult because you can't produce any level of stable assistance or build on assistance that family might have received previously. Instead, you're constantly addressing urgent, pressing needs again and again and again. So there is little opportunity for any sort of stability, of any sort of growth, of any sort of sustainable interventions when that family is displaced over and over and over. It is also characterised as a protection emergency. There are extreme protection risks, and Salma will cover this much more eloquently than I can right now. But the protection risks in Sudan far outweigh many of the other challenges that people are facing. Food insecurity is huge, but food insecurity also exacerbates other protection risks as well. So the sheer danger to civilians and the inability or unwillingness of most or all of the armed actors to properly safeguard the protection of civilians is the other characterization that this is why this is a protection crisis. This is not just exacerbated by the environment these people live in, it is exacerbated by the inability and the unwillingness of those with power to actually properly protect civilians. And lastly, just talk about it's a very complicated food insecurity environment. And by that I mean that we're seeing a juncture in the three pillars of availability, affordability, and accessibility of food. There is food in the market. There is food available to people when you can get to it and when you can afford it. Sudan has largely been reliant on a food economy prior to the war that was heavily propped up by humanitarian aid, heavily dependent on trade coming in through Port Sudan on the coast, and heavily reliant on seasonal agricultural workers in Sudan's food basket, which sits in the east of the country. Since the start of the war, all three of those have been largely shattered. Trade has effectively stopped in through Port Sudan, and where it has been able to get in, it isn't making its way across the country evenly. Humanitarian aid has been bottlenecked either in Port Sudan or in Adre and Tina on the Chad border. And the workforce and the labour skills of those people who were regularly farming and producing crops largely in the east have either been displaced or shattered in their ability to actually routinely contribute to that agricultural production. So the pillars of food support across the country were fundamentally weak before the war and have now been essentially broken over the last 2 years. Affordably, we've seen massive spikes in currency fluctuation and liquidity, which makes affordability incredibly difficult. I was talking with a family yesterday in the camps here who were telling me about prices of simple commodities like a bag of sugar or a bag of sorghum in Al Fasher going for 10 to 15 times the rate that it should be at the market. So the conflict is seeing these huge spikes in basic commodity affordability, which stretches families' ability to really afford the basics. It also challenges their ability to properly plan for the future of what they will need to afford when it comes. Again, from a response perspective, a lot of our response today is heavily influenced by cash and voucher assistance. If we're constantly resetting those envelopes every time based on market fluctuations, it's incredibly difficult to find any level of stability. Fortunately, we have a pretty robust market analysis system, and this has proved really invaluable. But that affordability spike and those currency fluctuations is just unsustainable from a programming perspective. And lastly, on the accessibility, there can be availability of food and there can be affordability, but if people cannot reach markets, if they can't safely access them, then your ability to get food is fundamentally blocked. We've seen markets targeted deliberately by armed actors. We've seen civilian sites attacked, and we've seen markets set up in such a way that people are so far from them physically and so unable to move without leaving a member of the family behind or exposing themselves to significant risk, that sheer accessibility of the food is really, really challenging and really problematic. And lastly, we've got a real breakdown in civil services. So the civil service and the public sector in Sudan was weak to begin with. In large parts of the country, that civil sector has evaporated completely. So we're talking about public hospitals, infrastructure, energy, electricity, simple things like garbage and waste disposal. This compounds on top of everything else and really limits people's coping mechanisms and their capacities to properly meet their immediate needs. I'll show you two videos quickly that just show a little bit of an image of how both that displacement trajectory has moved over the last couple of years, and then how the hunger trajectory has moved. I'll play them twice because they're very short. But this shows you how and where these numbers have ballooned over the last 2 years and where they're heavily concentrated. And I'll play that again because it's really important to notice where people are concentrating outside of Sudan. This is Chad on the left and South Sudan primarily as the main impact points outside of the country, and then further up into Egypt. Now, Chad and South Sudan are struggling with their own internal issues and are not places that are stable and safe, nor are they countries that can fundamentally provide the support needed to a huge number of refugees outside the country. The last video, the next video I'll show you, if I can, is on the hunger mapping. Now this is data from the IPC reports from last year, and it shows over the last 2 years how we have seen the hunger situation in Sudan evolve. I'll ask you to keep an eye on the red color. The red is the areas in emergency, which is IPC 4 hunger levels. And again, IPC 4 is as high as you can have a food crisis without it legally being called a famine. In red, in IPC 4, you still have people that are dying from hunger, but it is not yet classified as a famine. But pay attention to the change in colour from March 2023, this is pre-war, to April 2025. Play that again, and remember, March 23 is pre-war, is pre the outbreak of the conflict, and up to where we are now. So this is our state of play at the start of the conflict 2 years ago, and this is where we stand today. Unfortunately, we don't have sufficient data to continue mapping this, and this is also not something that NRC actively maps. This is external resources. So we can't speculate too much further on that, but this situation is only deteriorating, and that massive swing you're seeing shows you, one, the state that we started with, and then two, where we are today. Where we are today. So today, this is the world's largest displacement crisis. It is often outside the news, particularly in Australia, and for a range of reasons, Gaza and Ukraine tend to take up our airwaves a little bit. But make no mistake, this is the largest displacement crisis in the world. We have famine in 5 locations. We're potentially expecting another 17 by the land season. We've seen widespread obstruction of humanitarian access across the board. Parties of conflict are preventing aid from reaching areas outside of their control or areas that they're attacking, and we've seen starvation used as a weapon of war to punish civilian communities. The conflict dynamics this year. So a couple of important developments. The Sudan Armed Forces have retaken Khartoum, the capital. This does not signify the end of the war. This, if anything, signifies an entrenching of zones of control and front lines. And from initial reports of agencies that have been able to access Khartoum is a place that is very unsafe, very unstable. There is significant contamination of unexploded ordnance. There's little in the way of infrastructure that it still works. There's a lot of very unsafe and unstable buildings, and there is still shelling and indirect fire from armed actors in the north of Omdurman, which is the sister city to Khartoum in the north. We have an ongoing offensive here in North Darfur right now. Rapid Support Forces and others continue to attack Al Fasher. So we are this conflict is not resting. It is accelerating. It is ongoing. We've also seen announcements of a parallel a government authority being announced by a collective of these actors as well, and that was earlier this month, and we're expecting more announcements in the coming weeks. So we're really seeing this year, we're seeing a really entrenching and a continuing of that conflict that is creating the humanitarian situation. As far as our needs projection, PIN is people in need, estimated by 30 million for this year, but we have major funding gaps within that. Right now, I think we'll get to this in the Q&A, but right now the response is about 9.9% funded for 2025. I can give you the exact numbers on what that coverage looks like, but yeah, there's significant funding gaps. We've got massive inflation issues. There's a compounded by economic collapse. There's discriminatory currency policies and problems. There's liquidity shortages. There's a huge range of issues when it comes to cash and markets. We have a protracted urban displacement in a lot of the larger urban cities, and then that cyclical rural displacement that I was talking about before. And we have spiraling protection risks across the board. So this is a dark day for Sudan. This is as bad as it's got so far. Again, some of those numbers for you. 15.8 million forcibly displaced, and 24.6 or 25 million in acute food insecurity. Our programming coverage, just for NRC, just to give you an idea of what we've been able to do, we've been able to reach about 1.6 million people over the last couple of years. Some of those numbers are there for you to have a look at. These are the primary areas that we work in. We have a presence across the Darfurs, in South Kordofan in the south, and in the east in Kosti and Darfur. So we're active in as many areas as we can be, and we're looking to fundamentally scale where we can. We work with a huge number of local partners, either in direct partnerships or supporting local volunteer initiatives, and that's actually been one of the most effective ways we've been able to support communities here in North Darfur. Has been able to support local volunteers who are bringing together enough resources to form community kitchens, and they can feed people. Again, remember, this is done purely volunteer. The funds that we're giving them pays for the food, pays for the equipment, pays for the setup, but it's all volunteer led, and it's really inspiring, to be honest, and truly amazing to see. The network is pretty extensive of humanitarian actors across the board. Coverage isn't consistent. Not everybody works everywhere, and not everybody has the same access to everything. And the system has been stretched and challenged in a way that I haven't seen from other crises in terms of its ability to properly function, properly network, properly share information, and properly coordinate, and properly make decisions around safety, security of staff and resources, and principled access and consistent engagement with armed actors as well. We'll leave it there. That's my sort of broad overview, and I'll hand over to Salma to speak more specifically about protection, because I do think it's important that we really focus quite heavily on the protection challenges that people are facing. So thanks very much, and over to you, Salma.
Thank you, Noah. I just want to say one thing for people listening and for the recording. You mentioned that it was 25 million people at risk of hunger. That was the stat. That's 92% of the Australian population. So if you can imagine 92% of Australia in that situation, because sometimes we find it hard to imagine the sheer scale of those numbers. Thank you. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, really good for perspective, Samantha. Thank you. Yes, that's Australia. That's Australia in acute food insecurity, needing some sort of food assistance, and maybe for the sake, that's not knowing when your next meal is coming from. That's selling assets to pay for food when you can. That's prioritizing giving food to your children over adult members of the family, and that's making some horrific decisions around what you might have to do with your own body for food. So that in context, that times Australia is what we're looking at by numbers.
Thank you. Would you like to stop sharing the screen, or will you share the same presentation?
Just the same one will be up. I have talking points, so we don't want to, but I'm happy to share the notes with everybody on the call afterwards. Because, yeah, hopefully that's okay with everybody. Hi, everybody. My name is Salma, and thanks so much, Samanti, for that perspective. It really does give people something to think about when you put it that way. So from my end, just to complement what Noah presented to you all, I'm going to be talking about the protection crisis. As Noah mentioned, Sudan is a protection crisis. And in most of the time when people hear this, if you're not in the humanitarian sector, it's really not that easy to understand. So exactly what does this mean? So protection crisis involves a few things. It's not limited to what I'm going to be just saying on this call, but essentially it means there's a widespread violence or abuse. This includes killing, torture, sexual violence, and abductions. It also includes forced displacement, as it was highlighted in Noah's presentation, or inability for families and groups to return safely back to their homes, lack of access to justice, documentation, or just basic rights, as well as the breakdown of the rule of law. This also actually includes the targeting of aid workers, hospitals, schools, and civilians. And this is why, access is also a huge issue for us, as well, as mentioned by Noah. So essentially, when we talk about protection of civilians, we are saying when civilians' lives and rights are under constant threat, and the systems that are meant to actually protect them, whether this is the government, the legal, the community, have collapsed, or it's being ignored. So with that all said, just to say that Sudan actually is being neglected, not only financially, but also diplomatically. So while all this is happening, the humanitarian sector has been paralyzed, not only by the situation in country, but also what's happening globally in terms of the funding cuts have severely impacted the operations on the ground. As we stand, Noah did present the numbers. As we stand now, Sudan is only funded 9.9% out of the total appeal that it requested for. And this is further, even with the little humanitarian that is coming in, it's actually made worse by the aid block, the manipulation of the aid block at the checkpoints, the prevention of this actually critical aid reaching those people in siege-like situations. So in the presentation that Noah presented, he did mention about the local responders and how such a huge role the communities played. And really, it's very important for us as NRC not to downplay that. And we really also wanted to share that with you. With all this work happening, is not only the INGOs or the UN, but also there are local responders on the ground who were at the forefront. So because of now the civil service breaking down, the INGOs and the UN operations slowing down, the local Sudanese communities actually came together. And this included both teachers, it included youth groups, the community volunteers who kept the people alive in areas where we were unable to access. And how they exactly did this was setting up communal kitchens, organizing emergency shelters for the communities they were operating in, and of course, distributing food and cash and medical support. Just to give you an example, in North Darfur, the communal kitchen was run completely by volunteers. They fed the entire population of North Darfur, but unfortunately, the center was burned down with the volunteers themselves inside the center. So the local groups were really a lifeline, and they're still a lifeline for the population that are in this siege-like conditions. And we really did want to mention this on this call in terms of not only how much they're doing and how much they've actually been impacted themselves. So really, when it comes to access, is not just only a consequence of conflict, but is actually being used as a tool of war, just coming also from a protection hat. This is how I would put it. So this in turn, access denial is an active protection risk that we are seeing. It's worsening the displacement, it's worsening the hunger, and then of course, making the lack of services even worse. So the next element I wanted to touch base on is the gender protection risk. So when we're looking at when conflict and any violence happening, especially in Sudan, what we've seen is the deliberate targeting of civilians homes that were being burned down, the looting was happening, families being separated. And actually with recent assessments that we've conducted, we've seen very large numbers of unaccompanied and separated children who are not with their families, and this actually makes them even more vulnerable to sexual exploitation or child labor. So people are not only facing violence, they are also dealing with the deep psychological trauma, hunger, and the total loss of livelihood to support themselves. So before I go into the services of how we support the community, I really just want to put a caveat that as an NRC, we are not mandated to do gender-based violence and child protection services. But how does NRC address the protection risk that we are seeing in the areas where we have footprints or where we're working with partners? So we have something that is called protection from violence. Essentially, in simple terms, what this means is getting ahead or mitigating those risks that are associated with those vulnerabilities and risks. So we have 4 key pillars within the core CC that we're working in, one of them being the civilian self-protection. Essentially, in simple terms, this means helping civilians find ways to actually protect themselves. So we train the committees that have been selected by the communities. They map those risks. We train them. We go through a prioritization exercise with them, and then we come up with an action plan. So once this is finalized, as NRC, thank you, Noah. Yes, core competency. When I say CC, that's what it means. I'll try and not say too many acronyms. So CSP means civilian self-protection. So once we develop this action plans, as NRC, we just don't back out and say, okay, Dan, we've helped you, we've developed an action plan. We actually help resource and put some funding into this action plan so they actually materialize and they benefit the communities that have worked so hard in prioritizing and identifying what is the most concern they have as a community. The second pillar, we work as NRC and where we support vulnerable women, men, the elderly, and persons with disability is something called individual protection assistance. So here is where we provide our in-depth protection case management. Usually this is where we take vulnerable women and like I said, we don't work with children because the LNRC is not mandated of it, but we work with vulnerable women, the elderly, persons with disability. We take them through the protection case management process where we identify their issues, we develop a case plan for them, identify other service providers, because again, NRC could not meet all their needs, but we'll make sure our referral pathways are updated. So essentially referral pathways are a service directory, in other words, where we have different agencies. We have our focal points, we'll call them up, and then we refer our clients to them for further services. One of the biggest component within this individual protection assistant is something called cash for protection. As Noah mentioned, this is really one of our biggest ways of supporting the community, where we provide individuals with cash to urgently address their needs that they may require, whether if a market is partially functioning or fully functioning, and they don't have that money to acquire a particular maybe products from the market, we will facilitate for that, because a lot of the time their vulnerability is taken advantage of. So we are trying to limit that by providing them with those resources to access the food, medical supplies, or whatever that they might need, or transportation even. We also have site management. This is where we do a lot of our coordination and site governance within the gathering sites or the camps. And we are supporting the communities to come together, form committees. They do safety audits. They do so that they can make the camps as safe as possible while they're there. And then, of course, we also play a huge role in coordinating also with other actors to make sure we're not overlapping our services. And then, of course, the last pillar that as NRC we do, this is called the thought leadership pillar. And this is where a lot of our assessment work, our coordination with the cluster system and the authorities and other actors and advocacy happens. So in practical terms, this means we are just helping people who have fled attacks to relocate to safer places, help them get basic needs to their families, refer them, and then we provide emergency food and support to those trapped in areas where they're unable to come out of, but then we use our local partners in terms of those areas where as NRC, we don't have actual footprint there. So for us as the NRC, maybe just I wanted to just give you a quick example. In the last couple of months, we supported about 1,000 vulnerable individuals, and we realized actually most of them, when we did the analysis, were women, and many of them were living with disability. So you can imagine the compounded and layered vulnerabilities that they're facing. They've been displaced multiple times. They're either alone or they have no protective mechanisms around them because of how many times they've moved. So to survive and to, we support them now to at least rebuild some semblance of life together. So some of the risks that we have been identifying through our systems and the caseworkers is the targeting of civilians, the destruction of homes. So when civilians are targeted and we're able to support, we will provide cash for emergency relocation, or if they've been harmed in any way, we will then cover the medical expenses for the traveling, so from point A to B. So the next aspect I wanted to cover is in terms of the humanitarian sector being tested, as what based on Noah has presented and what I have said. Things need to change a bit in terms of how can the humanitarian adapt in this new way of working with the funding cuts, with access issues, with humanitarians also not being safe and clearly being targeted by the conflicting actors. The traditional models tied to this large international footprints are failing, especially in locations where RSF is controlled or besieged, so where most civilians are trapped. So what countries like Australia can do is fund agile programming. And when we really say this is when, let's say, for example, the pool fund is released, the processes of just applying for the fund is just so long. And when you're in emergency area, you don't have time to write a 20-page proposal. So there also needs to be some sort of criteria of if we are in an emergency area, donors and countries need to recognize that and maybe readjust those so that funding can be released immediately to cope with those responses. I've worked in context where the funding, not Sudan, for example, in Somalia, where the funding was released after the drought and we were in the rainy season. So that money no longer served its purpose. And then we go back to the drawing board and now we are discussing the flooding. So funding needs to come when it's supposed to come so that it can address those issues we're dealing with at that moment. So again, the other recommendation would be the agencies to just work with prioritize flexible humanitarian access, as I said, so the agile funding, prioritize agencies that will work with local partners directly who are able to access. So whether this is through an ING or UN or actually just funding those local partners directly and, assuring that protection is centered so that we can acquire dignity and local leadership. In a lot of our humanitarian response, we do say protection, centrality of protection, but a lot of the time this is lip service. So when people write their proposals, these beautiful words will be put in documents, but then when it comes to the actual implementation and ensuring that there is centrality of protection, it's really, there's just a grade is given, like a grade for, yes, we are doing protection mainstreaming, but also for donors for these agencies to hold them accountable in ensuring that protection is central to their programming, and then whatever that we're doing is actually not causing any further harm to already traumatized communities that we're working with. So in conclusion, just to wrap up, I would say fund local responders directly or through NGOs that are working with them, prioritize flexible humanitarian access and center protection. And of course, countries, and especially countries like Australia, I was about to say Somalia, has an opportunity to step up financially and diplomatically to support Sudanese community who really urgently need this support. And I'm just going to stop right here and hand the floor back over. But thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Summer. You covered so much ground in such a short time, and I really do thank you. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate about your remarks and Noah's as well is how, because of the depth of your experience, you are able to contextualize what is happening in Sudan. And I want to put this question to you both before I open up the floor to others. You've both been involved in the humanitarian response in other country contexts. In fact, Noah, when we first met, you were at Cox's Bazar, mentoring one of our students, actually, which we still think is remarkable. And Summer, you just mentioned that you have been working across the continent in several contexts as well. When you think about that experience and the challenges that you're facing today in Sudan, in particular, I think the targeting of civilians, the targeting of humanitarian workers, I have to admit, when you were explaining, Salma, that the people on the ground, they were so brilliant, they had set up the kitchen, and then your next breath, it was about how they were targeted and killed, and that took it's really confronting. Given this, I mean, how normal is this type of targeting in your experience? Has the frequency, I mean, I can look at the stats. For me, it seems like the frequency and the reporting of these types of targeted attacks on hospitals, on food providers, on humanitarian aid sector, it's going up. So in your experience, do you feel that that's the same? Sam, I'll ask you first and then we'll go to Noah.
No, thank you. I think for me, Sudan was the most shocking one in terms of in the countries that I've worked in, which before joining our NRC mission in Sudan, I was in Afghanistan. And when it comes to targeting of the humanitarian actors being in the Access Working Group, the most that we dealt with was humanitarians being arrested. But the Access Working Group through the NGO forum will negotiate and then they will be released, or them not giving us MOUs. So being my most recent experience, I would say Sudan just ranks higher in terms of not only being, just between March 2024 and last year and this year, almost 23 humanitarian actors were killed. And this was in an ACAPS analysis that was done. And I will share the link in the chat box. Just to show you the difference in the two contexts. And of course, I would say the closest experience that I've seen humanitarian actors directly being impacted is South Sudan, where we've been in areas where hospitals were burned down. Humanitarian aid was being actively looted at night. And of course, our national staff, because of the tribal dynamics, were directly attacked. So it was very strange where when we went in, it was much easier for international staff to go into those locations because it was not actually safe for us to send our national colleagues to those locations. So maybe those will be just maybe the three very different experiences I can share, but I hope I answered your question.
Can I ask you what period you witnessed those things happening in South Sudan? What year?
It was in 2022.
Okay. Yeah. I was just trying to see if there was a sharp uptick in these types of attacks over the last 3-4 years. Thank you. Noah, how about yourself?
Yeah, so look, unfortunately, it's becoming increasingly normal. So I think if I think back to my first humanitarian role in Palestine in the West Bank in 2016 to now. We commemorate World Humanitarian Day on the 19th of August every year, and without fail, every year the numbers are. This year was the deadliest year on record for humanitarian workers. The next year, this year on record was the deadliest year on record for humanitarian workers. It gets worse every year. What we're seeing in Sudan now is definitely reminiscent also to my time in South Sudan. I think so I want to share some experiences there. But I think what's also really important to remember when we talk about this is disproportionately the impact when it comes to safety of humanitarian workers is national staff and is national female staff is primarily the most at risk and the most aggressively targeted group. but this is also not just Sudan. If we look at the recent killing of the Palestinian Red Crescent ambulance workers in Gaza, continued attacks on Ukrainian frontline workers, attacks on local aid and civil service groups in Congo, continued assault on all sorts of civil sector groups across South Sudan. This is increasingly, for some reason, I don't know why, for some reason, increasingly becoming a norm and an accepted standard that doesn't generate the outrage that it used to, and doesn't generate the pressure from governments or from state actors on those with power and influence. And this is where we often get asked, what can we do more? We can't provide funding, or this funding gap is so huge it becomes something that's impossible to sort of grapple with. I think even Australia has a moral duty and a moral obligation to hold parties to conflict accountable to adhering to humanitarian law, standards and laws of armed conflict, and ensuring the protection of civilians and aid workers. Civilians and aid workers are not targets. Hospitals are not targets. Food distribution sites are not targets. Markets are not targets. Ambulances are not targets. None of these things are acceptable. None of these things will ever be acceptable. And the continued blind eye to a lot of these ongoing attacks is incredibly troubling. These incidents tend to make news headlines momentarily, but then they don't necessarily change the uptick. Relief International, our colleagues, lost 15 staff in Zamzam camp, which is, like I said, 40 kilometres down the road from where I am now, and that has not been sufficient enough of a watershed moment to fundamentally change the behaviour of the armed actors in this region. There has been insufficient diplomatic and political pressure to properly address these issues. So it has got worse over my career. It has somehow become more accepted. It is definitely different in an internal, in a civil war context than it is in a refugee context. When I think about my time in Bangladesh, or working on refugee responses in Europe around Ukraine, is definitely different to an internal war. But I would say the most worrying trend is the level of acceptance that this seems to just be become accepted now, and that is really, really worrying, because we are shunning norms that have stood for a very long time, and we're shunning practice, and we're now collectively saying that this is okay. And that is fundamentally a moral failure, and that doesn't require money, that doesn't require an investment to aid agencies, that doesn't require big checks and envelopes. That requires moral fibre and moral backbone, and leveraging the mechanisms of power that we have, and the Australian government has that, and the Australian government can do that. We are not a large player in the diplomatic space globally. That's to be fair. But we have a number of mechanisms. We have close relationships with a number of allies who are large diplomatic power players, and it is our moral obligation to do what we can to ensure that is respected. And right now, it's not happening.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts. I'd like to open the floor to people on the call. So either you can raise your hand, or and I need to figure out if I can see you, or perhaps, oops, sorry. I'm not sure if anyone has their hand raised. So we've got a question in the Q&A. I'm keen to understand a little bit more about the education situation. You'd assisted 150K-ish IDPs. Do you have a general read on how IDPs in Sudan view the provision of education in terms of its quality, usefulness? Is education something that IDPs are seeing as valuable, or are they currently seeing it as a second-order concern, given the dire circumstances you've outlined? Thanks, Steve.
Sure, I can talk to that. Education is incredibly valuable. It's also incredibly important. Remember that we've seen a complete collapse in civil services and public sector. So a lot of the education that is provided is through agencies like ours and is informal temporary education. What NRC does is a lot of education emergencies, where we will quickly set up sort of a temporary school, temporary learning space in displacement sites, and look after children and resume that education. Now that's really valuable for two reasons. One, normalising a process for children. We also have a special program called BLP, which is the Better Learning Program. The Better Learning Program is a psychosocial support program to help children deal with trauma. So whilst we don't do child protection specifically, the Better Learning Program does help address some of those acute shocks from trauma. And the other thing that education does in a context like this where I am right now is it provides space for parents and caregivers to access other services. We talked about accessibility to markets earlier. If you're looking after 3 children and you're the only adult in the family, accessing a market to actually procure food is incredibly challenging. If those children are now in school for a couple of hours, that gives you the ability to find food, find water, repair shelters, look for work, and look at a number of things. So education is extremely valuable. We work in a number of areas where one of the constant requests from authorities and communities is for education services. It's to normalise education for their children. It's to support the existing education infrastructure and architecture that there is, or it's to set up something entirely new. Obviously, people will always be looking at their emergency needs of food, water, medicine, and shelter. But education is sometimes I think seen as a secondary priority. I would say, to be honest, it's up there with those emergency needs, because this is also that future generation. And if we want to have any impact on sustainability of these interventions, if we want to have any ability to sort of build on these programs that we're implementing right now, education is going to be the way that we do that, and that opinion is largely shared by displaced people themselves and communities and authorities.
Thank you, Noah. We have Aishna, I think you had your hand up before. Would you like to ask a question? Aisha, sorry.
Hi, yes. Oh, you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
All right. So actually, you mentioned that there's refugees in South Sudan as well, right? So I just wanted to know this displacement dynamic between both Sudan and South Sudan. How does that affect the humanitarian sphere when you're walking on ground?
Thank you.
Do you want me to start, Noah? Okay. So maybe what I would do is when I left South Sudan, that's actually when the Sudan conflict happened, when we started receiving a lot of the Sudanese refugees at the border area. So when it comes to a lot of them coming over to South Sudan, there was a lot of tension, because also South Sudan is also described as a protection crisis. And, they're having the same situation without the full-blown active war that is happening in Sudan. So when it came to just providing aid, it was really a fine balance of making sure you're providing for the already existing IDPs within South Sudan, and then the refugees coming. So we did have a bit of tension, and this kind of changed also the landscape of the humanitarian response within South Sudan, because in South Sudan, we have something that is called the protection of civilian sites. And the last protection of civilian sites is in an area called the Malakal. I've been out of South Sudan. I'm trying to remember my map where it was located, but the POC was up. Yes, you're right. Thanks, Noah. So the POC is located up in the north of South Sudan, and this is where a lot of the South Sudanese citizens that were displaced when the civil war broke out. So when I say the landscape was being changed, this also changed the conversation that was happening in South Sudan, because we're receiving not only refugees and returnees, because there were refugee South Sudanese in Sudan, they were coming back to South Sudan. So in terms of also when I say the landscape, that when elections are happening, a lot of them did not want a particular tribe settling in some location, changing that dynamic, and discussions about transition from the protection of civilian sites, the discussion started without a proper plan, because there was such a rush in closing those sites when we didn't have a really good plan in terms of what will happen next. In terms of, if we close this, we have an influx of refugees coming in. The IDPs are also suffering. We also had the returnees coming in. So it was really a lot of layered things happening within the country. And it was very overwhelming for also the humanitarian sector to respond, because also the funding was really, really very, very small, very tiny portion. So maybe that would be the experience I can say, because I was there at the beginning. But maybe, I don't know, Noah, if you want to add to the latter of that. But I hope I answered partially part of your question.
No, I think that's perfect, Salma. I was actually back in Juba, the capital of South Sudan, last year, briefly, and I worked in South Sudan in 2016. And one of the things that struck me was how familiar Juba felt, 8 years apart, and also how familiar the context and the challenges were that people were dealing with, where we were really sort of stuck in a loop. South Sudan has really suffered from decreased interest and decreased funding over the last few years, so particularly when Salma was there. So having that compounded by a huge refugee and returning influx, and those dynamics of refugee versus returnee is really problematic, right? Like someone said, you've got people who are South Sudanese who had been living in Sudan for a long time returning. You have people in Sudan who are coming back into South Sudan, and these are incredibly porous borders normally, right? People are traditionally moving across these borders for work, for agricultural seasons. Communities are blocked across these borders, and there's a lot of transitory flow. So it stresses existing resources, it stresses existing relationships, and it also stresses the ability of the aid community to properly reach those people. What's happening right now in South Sudan with election instability and with rising political tensions will directly impact the crisis in Sudan. I think we're all watching with bated breath to see what happens a bit in Juba and what the impact is for people immediately in South Sudan, and then for people's ability to flee to South Sudan for safety. But for many people, particularly out in the Darfurs, South Sudan was the only option, or the only safe option, and that's why we've seen such a shift in a movement. So it's definitely one to watch.
Thank you. I'm wondering if anyone else has any questions on the panel before I pose. Sorry, for the panel. Yes, we've got one. Priya, thanks you for the webinar. The humanitarian crisis also has a catastrophic impact on women and girls, with a twofold increase of gender-based violence. What does the support look like for local women-led organisations themselves to respond to GBV? It's a great question.
No, it is a great question. Thank you so much. And I'm saying that because also as NRC, I think me and Noah have said many times that we're not a GBV and child protection actor, but we do the mitigation and prevention part of it. So for us we don't also as NRC want to use that as an excuse as not to respond. But as NRC, we have partnered with agencies that are specializing in GBV and child protection. So we've just received a recent funding where we've actively actually sought out a national partner that has been doing GBV and child protection for many years in Sudan. So when it comes to supporting the women-led agencies or national-led agencies, the support, I'm hoping this is the question, the support that we provide as NRC, and this is really, I saw a question on the chat in terms of localization, and my response will really be heavily anchored on that. When we're looking at the localization agenda, as NRC, we make sure we have a grants opening meeting with the partners. We do trainings, especially when it comes to protection risks. We give them trainings in terms of how do you communicate this sensitive topics, especially when you're crossing checkpoints. These authorities are asking you, what are you going to do in this camp? So how do you respond to this? So we equip them with the tools they need, the language that they need to use in this when they're going to the field. We've recently started training them on how to do good analysis, because a lot of the national partners were really having a challenge with that in terms of how do you put the work that you've done on paper. And again, this is the problem with localization, is how is it done being done correctly? So this is something really, as NRC, as Noah has mentioned, all of our interventions, if not most of them, we are partnering and implementing them through partners, but we are also making sure that we are also sharing all the information with them. And this also includes opening up training opportunities that are also available to NRC staff, which we're actually planning also a lot of them in the coming months, once we get into also Darfur. We'll be joining NOAA soon. So I don't know if that was the question, but we make sure also we equip them, especially when it comes to the GBV partners. As NRC, we have the liberty of having a really huge cash grants when it comes to the individual protection assistance. So some of these national partners don't have enough cash to give to the survivors, the GBV survivors, or address those child protection issues. So we share this information with them and we tell them, okay, we don't do this particular caseload you have, but if you don't have the resources to further support this individual, just reach out to us and then we will support you. And then we just transfer the cash to them for them to help them set that up. And then when it comes to the reporting mechanisms, we help them do their output indicators, their outcomes, just to make sure that their reporting is also really well in terms when it comes to accountability and reporting back to the donors. So I hope I answered the question, but maybe I can give it to also Noah if you want to add something to that.
No, I want to add nothing to add to your answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from people who are participating? Can pop your hand up or write in the chat. I wanted to ask you, and the reason that I called this kind of Seeing Sudan was really about the silence on the issue. A news story once in a way will pop up in Australian media, and because I'm following these topics on my social media, it will come into my my feeds. But other than that, I mean, Australia has been pretty quiet. They'll issue a statement. This is the government will issue a statement now and then. I want to pick up on this notion of silencing, given the amount, the level of crises in the world, given the number of conflicts, given that now we are seeing, the use of food as a weapon of war in Sudan, in Palestine, and other places, and humanitarian aid. What would you like to see change in terms of how we have this conversation in a place like Australia? You've mentioned some of the topics, but if you had a wish list, let's say, Salma, from your perspective as the protection person and Noah as the coordinator, from your, I've just given you, I'm Santa, I don't know, and I'm asking you, fill in this piece of paper and you will get whatever you write down. And how do we change this narrative is one of the main things for me and why I really wanted to host this. And the second seminar, we will be engaging with people from the Sudanese diaspora here in Australia as well. But from your perspective, I guess it's a two-part question. One, how do we change this narrative and how do we ensure there is greater visibility? And two, what's your wish list? What do you want to see changed?
Maybe I can start with my wish list as a protection actor, because I don't know if any of you remember one of the slides of Noah. As the protection from violence, we usually get the least funding when it comes to the direct support of vulnerable communities. But I think one of the things that I would like to say, especially to countries and donor countries, is at the beginning, I mentioned something called centrality of protection. This is really, it is anchored in any humanitarian response, and this is the thing that we call protection mainstreaming. I'm not sure if the attendees on the call are familiar with this, but it's kind of just applying the humanitarian principles across our response. But a lot of the time, this is used as an excuse not to fund specialized protection programming directly. So if I'm saying protection mainstreaming, that is a given. An agency automatically should do that. And that is not something that they're doing out of the kindness of their heart. This is what humanitarian services is. So this is not something that you just wake up one morning and decide, oh, we'll just do it. No, whether you're a food actor, wash actor, you have to apply centrality of protection. You have to mainstream protection into your work. But one of my wish lists will be for donors and countries like maybe Australia to actually fund protection programs directly and invest in it, because a lot of the time when you hear them talking, you do hear the word thrown around, this country is a protection crisis, but then the money is not put behind it. So one of the things that I want to mention also is with the funding cuts, protection is by presence. We can never do protection remotely. As protection actors, our case workers actually have to be on the ground where they're actually interacting with these groups so that they can support them. So this also impacted, we've lost almost 25 plus staff that are doing protection. So staffing for us is really important. And this is why I'm saying, one of my main wish lists is with even the funding cuts happening, protection should still be at the forefront. And it should be funded directly. So this will be my pitch to if there are donors on this call. I'm really looking forward to receiving additional support from all of you. So I don't know, Noah, maybe over to you.
Yes, we're always like I said, we're always short on funds. So I think one of the issues, particularly with Sudan, is that it feels very far away, and it feels very impossible to sort of change and influence. Seeing what we deal with and what we work with, seeing what I'm seeing here on a daily basis in these camps. The short answer is to why is this not talked about more? I genuinely don't know. I really don't know. I have theories around domestic political appetite in countries like Australia, but I really don't know when we're looking at the scale and the need. What I would like to see change on that is I would like to see more visibility and more conversation, and I would like to see more of an acknowledgement that whilst, like someone said, whilst we continue to need funding for these really critical gaps, specifically in protection, what we need and what we can ask for is awareness, is conversation, and is support. Australia is host to an active and vocal Sudanese diaspora community, and I'm really glad that you've got the opportunity to have a few people come and speak. These are people who've fled the atrocities in Darfur in 2008, who fled the outbreak of civil war in South Sudan in 2011 and 2013. And who've come across more recently. There is an active part of this community that Salma and I deal with on our side, living with and amongst you in the suburbs of our cities and in our rural towns in Australia. And we owe it to them as Australians, as fellow Australians, to support their cause, to be curious, to ask questions, to investigate, and to understand how we can help. I know we're gearing up for an election tomorrow, and I know that is fundamentally our primary focus. And what I'm surprised by when I've looked at the coverage from the election, and even when I've done my own vote mapping compass, is that the lead issues that are circulating right now are all entirely domestic. We are not worrying about foreign affairs. We are not worrying about our neighbours, and we are not worrying about our place in the world. And whilst it may seem token, engaging with local MPs, engaging with federal members for parliament, engaging with ministers is not nothing. And stressing to those people that we want action, that we want leverage, that we want power, that we want use through our mechanisms in trade, in the United Nations, in regional bodies like ASEAN, in our engagement with big powers like the US and the UK, that we put Sudan on the table, that we ask what this pressure is. We might not be able to pull those levers of power, but we can engage in those conversations with our counterparts and say, what are you doing to address this? Where is the action? Are you protecting safety of civilians? Are you reaching out to those who are committing these atrocities in Sudan? Are you holding them accountable to this? Are you documenting evidence? There is no reason for Australia to shy away from that role. So my wish list would largely be the same as Selma's when it comes to funding, but I would add to that conversation and engagement in this crisis, and a willingness and an interest to say that just because we are small and just because we do not necessarily have large amounts of foreign aid money, and this budget in Australia has been systematically cut under multiple governments for a very long time, and continues to be so, but that it is our moral responsibility to be across these issues. Having strength of presence in the streets of Melbourne and Sydney and beyond for the atrocities in Gaza is really heartening. Seeing that from abroad, and as someone who worked in Palestine, it's always really encouraging to see solidarity amongst the Australian community. I haven't seen the same level of active conversation and engagement around Sudan. I haven't seen that, and I don't know why. I don't know what we need to do. I don't know how many more stories need to come out. But I would say be curious. I would say talk to people, read the news that is available, read the sources that are there, and engage with your government, engage with your policymakers and your stakeholders. Even attending stuff like this is brilliant, and engage with the diaspora. Talk to people, ask how they can help, ask how you should help, ask how you should know, ask how you should be engaged, and I think we can quickly find some answers.
Thank you so much. And I think we've got two really important questions, so we're going to squeeze them in. They came out right at the end, but they're really important ones. So one of the questions, you can both read them as well, I think, in the Q&A, from Richards. Again, thanks you for the webinar. What is the role of regional and sub-regional bodies in conflicts like the one in Sudan? From your experience, to what extent is the African Union on the ground? And the second question from Gemma, what role, if any, do Southern donors play in Sudan? Do you think their role may become more important with the recent cuts in aid? And do they have an interest in Sudan? Both really fantastic questions. So shifting away from global South countries to looking at, more South-South connections. Yeah.
Sure. Maybe I might have a crack at both of those and then hand to Selma for your opinion on them as well. So with respect to regional politics and the African Union, our focus is largely humanitarian of what we see. We're not that across the nuances of the politics. There have been multiple failed peace efforts, though, whether that's been through engagement with the African Union, through talks hosted in Saudi Arabia last year, and through bilateral diplomatic efforts. There's been continued efforts on a number of fronts that just haven't worked. The African Union isn't physically in Sudan as an entity, or as a peacekeeping force or anything, but they are definitely engaged at the sub-regional level, and at this. I mean, it may sound as a platitude, and it's not meant to, but I would say at this point, anything that could be done, whether that is bilateral, whether that is involving someone like the African Union, the UN, the Jeddah delegations, Gulf partners, European powers, the conference last week or the other week in London, any effort is needed right now. I'm not sure that there is one diplomatic tract that needs to be prioritised over any others. At this point, I would say we are on the brink of easily one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of this century, and any and all effort to arrest that is needed. We shouldn't be prioritising one over anything else. We should be throwing absolutely everything at the wall to try to find a solution. As for southern donors, look, unfortunately, we still work in a humanitarian ecosystem where money and power is largely vested in wealthy Western countries. We are collectively looking at diversification of that donor pool, and there's efforts ongoing for the Norwegian Refugee Council and for the humanitarian sector more broadly. I would again say that we don't necessarily need other donor country. We don't necessarily need specific donor countries to step up, or we're not asking for individual donors to sort of increase their funding. We're looking at the overall picture, which is 9.9% covered for 2025. So any source of funding that comes out from anybody is always welcomed, whether that is to organisations like us, whether, as Summer said, that is direct assistance to local responders. And this is one avenue where smaller philanthropic donors probably actually have an edge over some of the larger institutional donors, and that they can directly engage locally led initiatives and find partnerships that institutional state donors can't. So there's probably a space in there actually for some of those south to south connections, I think. But this is going to be small numbers and small impact compared to what we need sort of at the macro scale. So I would 100% actively encourage that. But unfortunately, I'm not sure that there is a South donor block that isn't stepping up. And just lastly, again, when we look at the region and the ecosystem that Sudan sits in, if a recommendation I would give to everybody on the call, particularly students, is listen to the Horn podcast from the International Crisis Group. The Horn talks broadly about crises in the Horn of Africa. This region of the world is absolutely beset by crises on all fronts. So it's also very difficult for the donors from the global south to really identify what those priorities are when you're seeing rising sea levels and desertification under climate change, really stressing communities. Food chains are stressed. We've got political systems under threat in Somalia, in South Sudan, in Mozambique. We've seen political assassinations in Kenya last week. There's instability across just this part of the world before you look beyond. So, yes, we would take anything from anywhere, but I think I'd be very cautious to put any additional level of responsibility back to southern global south powers to address this when I think many global south governments and people are struggling with far more than they need to do on their own anyway, and it's really a responsibility of us outside that system to step up with big money, with the influence and with the interventions to help across the board. But some of your perspectives, I think, are more important than mine.
No, I think I completely agree with you. I think as the NRC, we are looking at the bigger picture in terms of reaching out to all countries that are willing to support. I mean, just to also reiterate what Noah said in terms of the African Union, yes, politically they're engaged. We're not going to sit here and say, but there is a limited operational role, in terms of them being actually on the ground and supporting that, supporting access or, providing humanitarian response. But in terms of the ceasefire negotiations at the regional and international level, they are engaged. And I don't want to repeat anything Noah said, completely agree with him, but maybe that would just be something that I would add to that. But yes.
Thank you so much, both. Just listening to the conversation, this final part, I think what's emerging is the long-term resolution, peace building, to get to that point, and then to work on that. And how do we actually separate that out from the immediate need, the need which is transpiring right now? And to me, I kind of think back to the statistics that you've been sharing around aid delivery itself and the targeting of humanitarian sector workers, and the need to uphold Some are what you call protection standards and what we might be calling human rights law or humanitarian law as well, and the principles that have been embedded. And these are imperfect systems as they were created and evolved. But on the one hand, what we are seeing is the increasing transgression of those norms. And it's happening with quite a regular degree of impunity, as everyone is aware. The other question I think that you've raised, and maybe I'll conclude on this question, but also I'd like to respond to and reflect on Richard and Gemma's comments there. The question of visibility and making sure, that this conversation continues beyond this call, and it is happening now in some spaces, certainly in the Australian NGO sector, and we have been preoccupied with the election itself. And I think there is a bit of anxiety around this election, at least speaking for myself, when I think about what kind of a parliament are we going to have, and how will they be, responding to these types of crises as well. And everyone will have different answers to that. So my intention is not to kind of influence that vote, but I think it is important, as much as we are thinking about our domestic concerns, that we are also thinking about the international and the connections that many of us have to other countries around the world, but also the shared humanity. And I think the best way that I can put it again is, imagine if 92% of the Australian population was trying to figure out where to get their next meal. And how do we ensure that everyone's needs are seen and heard in this really loud, complex system that we think is in turmoil and crisis? But surely, and this leads me to Richard and Gemma's points in terms of the futures thinking and what we're aiming to think about and create going forward out of this, hopefully, is what are the alternatives now to this system that has been fractured, that's been challenged? What parts do we need to absolutely maintain, and what parts do we need to rethink? And that goes back to those conversations around localization, empowerment and funding, and all of those big questions. But for now, I will leave it at that. You both have much more important work to do. We're all probably going to go off and read more about the election and doom scroll overnight. But thank you so much for your time. And thank you very much to the participants who've really facilitated and enabled this really lively conversation. I just also want to say that we really appreciate you literally taking, I don't know, it's your day off. Is it your day off as well, Salma? Thank you so much for giving up your time, because I know how stressful things are. This type of work is not an easy breezy kind of having a holiday type of work. So we really appreciate it, and we hope you and your colleagues also remain safe. And just want to say, I mean, speaking for myself and probably most people on the call, we remain steadfast and in solidarity with the people of Sudan. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Samantha, and thank you all for joining and listening in. We really appreciate it as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Samantha. To students on the call, if you do have any further questions, or if there's anything you'd like to know, please have a chat to Samantha, and we're happy to speak or get in touch. Share any resources or recommendations or anything that we've talked about today. If there's anything else you'd like to know, just chat to Samantha, and she's got our contact, so you can get through to us.
Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording.